November 15th, 1990. The morning is beautiful. Clear skies. Cool California air. The kind of morning that makes you want to be outside. The kind of morning that makes you grateful to be alive. In Berkeley, California, a young woman laces up her running shoes. She takes a moment to appreciate the day. She is a jogger. She is an athlete. She is someone who values her health and her connection to nature. She is someone who loves the trails of Tilden Regional Park. She is Maria Weidhofer. And this is the last morning she will see. I'm Yoonjin Lee, and this is her story. This is the story of a brutal crime. This is the story of a mystery that lasted 35 years. This is the story of how modern technology finally revealed the truth that seemed hidden forever. Maria Weidhofer was 32 years old. She was an artist. She was a baker. She was a free-spirited woman who had moved from Southern California to Berkeley to pursue her dreams, to be closer to like-minded people, to build a life of meaning and creativity. She lived in a macrobiotic collective with 3 roommates. She worked evenings at a natural foods business in Oakland. She was quiet. She was shy. She was someone who kept her personal life private. But she was also vibrant. She was full of life. She had dreams. And on that beautiful morning in November 1990, all of those dreams were taken from her by violence. For 35 years, her family didn't know who had done this. For 35 years, the killer walked free. For 35 years, Maria's case remained an unsolved mystery, a cold case gathering dust in police files, a crime that seemed destined to remain forever hidden. But in 2025, everything changed. Advanced DNA genealogy technology provided the breakthrough that investigators had been waiting for. The killer's identity was finally revealed. This is the story of Maria Weidhofer. This is the story of how a beautiful morning run became a tragedy. This is the story of how justice, delayed by 35 years, finally came through the power of modern science. Do you believe that no crime is ever truly cold? Do you believe that technology can solve what seemed unsolvable? Can a beautiful park ever be reclaimed from the evil that happened there? If you want to discover how DNA genealogy is revolutionizing cold case investigations, if you want to explore the stories of victims whose names almost faded from history, please subscribe and turn on your notifications. We tell the stories that seem destined to remain unsolved. We remember the victims that society almost forgot. We investigate the mysteries that prove that time cannot erase the truth. Let's find the truth together. Tilden Regional Park is one of the most beautiful places in the San Francisco Bay Area. Located in the Berkeley Hills, overlooking the entire Bay Area, Tilden Park encompasses over 2,000 acres of pristine wilderness. Redwood groves tower overhead. Trails wind through the forest. Hikers and joggers frequent the trails year-round. It is a place of natural beauty, a refuge for people seeking escape from the urban sprawl of the Bay Area. In 1990, Tilden Park was a popular destination for runners and joggers like Maria Weidhofer. The trails were well maintained. The park was considered relatively safe. Thousands of people jogged the trails year after year without incident. On November 15, 1990, it was a typical morning in the Bay Area. The weather was pleasant. The season was transitioning from fall to winter, but Berkeley's climate was mild. It was the kind of day that brought people to the parks. Maria Weidhofer drove to Tilden Regional Park that morning. She was going to run on the trails near Inspiration Point, a scenic location on the Nimitz Trail that offered beautiful views and a challenging run. It was a trail she loved. It was a place she had run many times before. There was nothing to suggest that this morning would be different from all the others. She parked her truck at the Inspiration Point trailhead. She put on her running shoes. She began her jog. She had no idea that she was not alone. She had no idea that someone had been waiting for her. She had no idea that this run would be her last. The trail near Inspiration Point is about a mile long. It winds through a redwood grove, one of the most beautiful parts of Tilden Park. The trail is relatively isolated in some sections. There are places where a runner might encounter very few other people. It was on this trail that something terrible would happen. Maria Jane Weidhofer was born in Southern California. She was 32 years old in 1990. She was not a wealthy woman. She was not famous. She was not someone whose name would normally appear in the news. She was an ordinary young woman, pursuing an extraordinary life. She was an artist. She was creative. She was drawn to the Bay Area because it was a place where artists gathered, where like-minded creative people built communities, where alternative lifestyles were accepted and celebrated. She was a vegetarian. She lived in a macrobiotic collective with 3 roommates who shared her values and her vision. This was not typical suburban living. This was a conscious choice to live in a particular way, to align one's life with one's beliefs. She worked evenings at a natural foods business in Oakland. Her work reflected her values. She was helping to promote healthy living, natural foods, an alternative approach to nutrition and wellness. But above all else, Maria was someone who valued health and fitness. She was an avid jogger. She ran every day. The Tilden Park trails were her happy place. She loved the nature. She loved the physical challenge of running. She loved the solitude and the meditation of running through the forest. Her roommates knew her as someone quiet and shy, but someone who was pursuing her dreams. She had moved to Berkeley specifically to build this life. She had chosen this community. She had chosen this path. She was the kind of young woman who represented hope. She represented the belief that you could live differently, that you could pursue your values, that you could build a meaningful life even if it wasn't the mainstream path. She had no enemies that anyone knew of. There were no death threats. There were no signs of danger. She was simply a young woman jogging in a park on a beautiful morning. She had no idea that this decision would be fatal. November 15, 1990. Maria Weidhofer went for her morning jog. She parked her truck at the Inspiration Point trailhead. She set out on the trail through the redwood grove. The weather was beautiful. The trail was relatively quiet. It was the kind of morning that should have been perfect for a run. But somewhere on that trail, something changed. Somewhere on that quiet path through the forest, evil intervened. What happened in those moments can only be partially reconstructed through forensic evidence and witness testimony. The details are painful. The reality is horrifying. But they are important to understand. Maria encountered someone on the trail, someone who had been waiting, someone who had positioned himself to ambush her, someone who had violent intentions. The attack was brutal. It was sudden. It was violent. Maria fought. She struggled. She tried to escape. But she was overcome by someone stronger, someone who had the advantage of surprise, someone who was determined to inflict violence upon her. She was sexually assaulted. She was strangled with a rope around her neck. The autopsy would later reveal that her cause of death was asphyxia by ligature strangulation. The pathologist found a multitude of minor abrasions and contusions on her body, evidence of the struggle, evidence of the violence, evidence of her attempt to defend herself. But her attempt was not enough. She died on the trail in the redwood grove, killed by a stranger, murdered in a place that should have been safe. Her body was left near the trail. It was placed slightly off the path, but was still readily visible. The killer did not attempt to hide the body extensively. He simply left her there. Later that evening, when Maria didn't show up for work, her roommates became alarmed. They had expected her back from her morning jog. When she didn't arrive, they knew something was wrong. They drove to Tilden Regional Park. They went to the Inspiration Point trailhead where they knew Maria liked to jog. They found her truck. They called the police. Early the next morning, November 16, 1990, police responded to the scene. Officers and detectives arrived at Tilden Regional Park. They began searching the trails near Inspiration Point. About a mile north of Inspiration Point, on a trail through a redwood grove, they found her. Maria Weidhofer was dead. Her body was on the trail. There was a rope around her neck. There were clear signs of struggle and violence. An immediate investigation was launched. Crime scene specialists arrived. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. An autopsy was scheduled. The autopsy, performed at Contra Costa County Medical Examiner's Office, revealed the terrible details of what had been done to her. The pathologist collected biological evidence. Most significantly, semen was found on her body, evidence that the killer had left behind. This biological material would contain the perpetrator's DNA, though at that time in 1990, the technology to extract and analyze DNA was primitive by modern standards. The evidence was preserved. It was stored. It was maintained as part of the investigation. The East Bay Regional Park District Police Department opened a major homicide investigation. Detectives were assigned. Resources were dedicated. The investigation was thorough and extensive. Police interviewed hundreds of people. They followed hundreds of leads. They identified over 40 persons of interest. They conducted at least 6 suspect interviews. They examined the crime scene carefully. They looked for any clue that might point to the perpetrator. They searched for witnesses who might have seen something on the trail that morning. They pursued every possible angle. But despite the extensive investigation, no suspect was identified. The leads eventually ran out. The investigation, while initially intense, gradually lost momentum as the months progressed, and no breakthrough occurred. By 1991, the case had essentially gone cold. Years turned into decades. 1990 became 1991. 1991 became the 1990s. The 1990s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. The 2010s became the 2020s. For 35 years, Maria Weidhofer's case remained unsolved. Her family grieved. Her roommates mourned. The Berkeley community remembered her as a tragic victim of senseless violence. But as time passed, her case faded from the headlines. Other crimes demanded attention. Other victims needed resources. In 1997, 7 years after Maria's murder, her biological evidence was sent to the Contra Costa County Crime Lab for analysis. This was part of the advancement of technology. DNA analysis, which had been primitive in 1990, was becoming more sophisticated by the mid-1990s. The lab extracted a DNA profile from the biological evidence. This profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders. But there was no match. The killer, whoever he was, had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require him to submit his DNA to the system. So the case remained cold. The killer's identity remained hidden. The mystery continued. Maria's family waited. Every year on the anniversary of her death, they grieved anew. Every birthday she would have celebrated, they mourned what could have been. The pain never healed. The questions were never answered. 2005 came. 15 years had passed. Maria's family and the police department made a final push. They offered a $10,000 reward for information. They contacted the media. They tried to reignite public interest in the case. But no new leads emerged. The reward did not generate the breakthrough they hoped for. 2017 came. 27 years had passed. The technology had advanced further. Police generated predictive images of the suspect, 3D renderings showing what the killer might look like based on witness descriptions and DNA information. But these images, while technically impressive, generated little in the way of solid leads or suspect identifications. The case remained cold. The mystery remained unsolved. It seemed like Maria's killer would never be identified. It seemed like her family would never receive justice. But technology was continuing to advance, and something was about to change. In 2020, 30 years after Maria Weidhofer's murder, something significant happened. The East Bay Regional Park District Police Investigations Unit began collaborating with the Federal Bureau of Investigation on Maria's case. This collaboration brought new resources, new expertise, and most importantly, access to new investigative techniques. One of those techniques was investigative genetic genealogy, the same technology that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, in 2018. This technology had revolutionized cold case investigations. How does genetic genealogy work? Investigators take DNA evidence from a crime scene. They submit that DNA to public genealogy databases like GED Match, Ancestry, 23andMe, and others. If the suspect or his relatives have submitted their DNA to any of these databases, the genealogy databases can identify relatives of the suspect. Through family trees and genealogical relationships, investigators can work backward to identify the suspect himself. In Maria's case, her biological evidence had been preserved for 30 years. The DNA from that evidence could now be submitted to genetic genealogy databases. The FBI and the Park District Police began this process. They entered Maria's evidence into genetic genealogy databases, and they waited for results. In 2023, after years of work, results began to emerge. Through the use of advanced DNA techniques and investigative genetic genealogy, police identified a potential suspect. They began investigating this person. They researched his background. They traced his location history. They built a case. The potential suspect was John Lipari. John Lipari was in his 30s in 1990 when Maria was murdered. He was living in Martinez, California with his family at the time of the crime. He was the right age. He was in the right place at the right time. Police continued their investigation. More leads were pursued. More avenues were explored. By 2024, John Lipari had become their primary suspect. But there was a complication. Lipari had moved to Oregon years earlier. In fact, he had moved to Oregon shortly after Maria's murder in 1990-1992. He had been living in Gold Beach, Oregon, a small coastal community. He had apparently lived a quiet life for the past 30-plus years. The investigation intensified. Police prepared to approach Lipari for questioning. The FBI, the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, and the Curry County Sheriff's Office coordinated their efforts. They were preparing to make contact with Lipari, to question him, to gather additional evidence. But before they could do that, something happened that no one could have predicted. In early November 2024, nearly 34 years to the day after Maria Weidhofer was murdered, John Lipari was found dead in his residence in Gold Beach, Oregon. He had died by suicide. He had shot himself with a gun at his Gold Beach home. According to information released later, Lipari had been suffering from cancer at the time. A GoFundMe page started by a relative mentioned his illness. Investigators found no evidence that he was aware of the police investigation closing in on him. He took his own life before he ever knew that he was being investigated for Maria's murder. His death, while tragic in its own way, did not end the investigation. In fact, it allowed it to proceed in a different direction. When Curry County authorities discovered Lipari's body, they followed protocol for an unattended death. They collected evidence from the scene. They obtained a DNA sample from his body. This DNA sample was then compared to the DNA evidence from Maria Weidhofer's 1990 murder scene. The comparison was definitive. The DNA profile generated from the biological evidence collected from Maria Weidhofer's body in 1990 matched the DNA profile from John Lipari's body recovered in 2024. The same man who had murdered Maria Weidhofer 35 years ago was the same man who had just died in Oregon. In November 2024, on February 18, 2025, the East Bay Regional Park District Police Department, along with the FBI and the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, held a press conference to announce the resolution of the case. DNA evidence has conclusively identified the murderer in a 35-year-old case that took place in Tilden Regional Park, they announced. Detective Christopher Rudy of the East Bay Regional Park District Police Department stood before the cameras. He explained how investigative genetic genealogy had been used to identify Lipari as a suspect. He described how the investigation had progressed. He explained the DNA match that proved Lipari's guilt. When it was a match, it was definitely bittersweet, Detective Rudy said. I would have loved for him to know that we were zeroing in on him, but Lipari never knew. He took his own life before he knew that his decades of freedom had finally come to an end, before he knew that science had caught up with him, before he knew that the truth had been revealed. The investigation revealed important details about the crime and how it was committed. The killer had left biological evidence on Weidhofer's body, semen that contained his DNA. This was the primary evidence that allowed investigators to identify him 35 years later. Additionally, police found cigarette butts near a bench at the trailhead. These cigarette butts appeared to be from the killer, who had apparently waited at that location. lying in wait as he chose his victim. The killer had sat on a bench, smoking cigarettes, watching the trail, waiting for an attractive young woman to jog past so he could attack her. This deliberate waiting suggested premeditation. The killer had not stumbled upon Maria by chance. He had positioned himself there. He had waited for her. He had planned this attack. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that he had positioned himself to commit a crime against whoever came along. He was a predator, waiting for prey, and Maria happened to be the victim he selected that day. Multiple witnesses had seen someone matching Lipari's description at Tilden Park around the time of the crime. These witness descriptions, collected at the time of the investigation in 1990-1991, matched John Lipari's appearance. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA was definitive. John Lipari was the killer of Maria Weidhofer. When the announcement was made public on February 18, 2025, Maria's family was notified first. They were given the opportunity to make a statement. 35 years ago, our family was irreparably harmed by the loss of Maria, her brother Hans said, in a prepared statement that was delivered at the press conference. The ensuing years, our parents Jane and Carl struggled mightily with the psychological repercussions, including the frustration of knowing that the perpetrator was likely still free. Maria, the family, and the world have been carelessly cheated and deprived of her future. But the family also expressed gratitude for the relentless pursuit of justice. On behalf of our immediate and extended family, we would like to express our gratitude to law enforcement for their unceasing efforts, and finally, bringing some measure of closure to this tragedy. The family concluded with a statement about how they wanted Maria to be remembered. We shall remember Maria as a gentle soul pursuing her dreams, as an artist and baker in the Bay Area community she loved. Our wish is that she will be remembered for the person she was, and not for what happened to her. The investigation revealed that there was no previous contact between Maria and John Lipari. They were strangers. Maria had done nothing to provoke her attack. She was targeted by a predator who had positioned himself to commit violence against whomever came along. Police also investigated whether Lipari might have been responsible for other crimes. While they found no conclusive evidence linking him to other victims, some investigators expressed concern that this particular crime, the brazenness of it, the randomness, the willingness to commit such a serious crime in a public park during daylight hours, suggested that there might be other victims. Lipari had served in the U.S. Marines. He had moved around. He had lived in multiple states. The possibility existed that other crimes might be attributed to him. But as of the announcement in February 2025, no other victims had been identified. The resolution of Maria's case through investigative genetic genealogy became another landmark success for this technology. Like the Golden State Killer case, it demonstrated that even 35 years of cold could be overcome by the combination of preserved evidence and modern science. If Maria could speak, what would she say? Perhaps she would say, "Thank you for not forgetting me. Thank you for pursuing justice, even though it took 35 years. Thank you for using every tool available to find the truth." Perhaps she would say, "My death was violent and senseless, but my memory is worth protecting. My life mattered, even though it was cut short." Perhaps she would say, "Don't give up on unsolved cases. Don't believe that some mysteries will remain forever hidden. The truth is always there, waiting to be discovered. It just sometimes takes time." The parks of Berkeley can now begin to heal from the violence that occurred within them. Maria's family can now have answers. The investigators who worked on this case for so long can now know that their persistence was rewarded. 35 years is a long time to wait for justice. But justice, even when delayed for decades, is still justice. What do you think about Maria's case? What do you think about investigative genetic genealogy? Do you believe that technology has changed how we pursue truth? If you have thoughts, please share them in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to telling the stories of victims like Maria Weidhofer. The stories of free-spirited artists whose potential was stolen by violence. The stories of families that waited decades for answers. We believe that no victim should be forgotten. No case should remain cold forever. No killer should escape justice indefinitely. This is Yoon-Jin Lee, and this has been the story of Maria Weidhofer, a young woman whose murder was finally solved through the power of modern DNA science, 35 years after she was killed in Tilden Regional Park. Thank you for remembering her name. Thank you for believing that justice matters, no matter how long it takes.